I am your co-moderator, Will Gray. I'm a junior at Ohio University. I don't know. And I work at the Grid Lab as a VR developer.
I'm the other moderator, and my name is Alyssa Stahl. I also work at the Grid Lab as like a VR developer, and I'm a junior here.
Okay, if you guys want to go down the line and sort of introduce yourselves and say what you do in this space.
I'm James Gartland. I'm a virtual reality and augmented reality developer. I actually work with Tyler's company, Guesswork, and Super 77 in Columbus, Ohio.
Hello, my name is Tyler Blust. I am co-founder of GuessworkVR. I am also a game director and writer on our project Underwater.
Hello, I am Michael Stevens. I'm the senior developer at Super 77. Yeah.
All right, so for our first question for you guys is just for people in the audience who may not know kind of what virtual reality and augmented reality is defined as. Like, what do you guys describe VR and AR as?
So I do more augmented reality, so I'll cover that one. Virtual reality, you put on a headset and you're sort of engrossed in an entirely different world. Augmented reality uses the real world and then sort of augments virtual aspects on top of it, usually through a camera like a phone. What do you think about virtual reality, Tyler?
Well, kind of as you said, virtual reality is putting a headset on and kind of stepping foot into another world. But I think in general, at least our opinion at Guesswork, is VR and AR is kind of like the next step in entertainment. So for us, that is kind of what VR AR is taking what we already know and, taking it to a more immersive media. Do you have anything to add, James?
Yeah, so the way they're similar is they both sort of give everybody a new perspective, a new way to observe the experiences that we create.
Cool. So we've got some sort of guided questions to start off the discussion. Then we'll open it up to audience questions. First of all, when you guys are starting a new VR AR project, do you have to build from the ground up, like with VR and AR in mind? Because there are other sort of game ports that port existing games onto VR. Do you think you need to start at the bottom with VR in mind?
In my opinion, you definitely kind of want to scratch all your designs and start back from square one. I've tried porting projects, and it ends up being an entirely different design process anyways. So no matter how much work you already have done, you have to design a whole new experience for those mediums.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what James said, to me, it's really hard to take a game that we already play now, like they've kind of done with Skyrim and Fallout, and make it a fun VR experience. Because to me, VR is taking, you're not holding a controller anymore, really. You're using your whole body, you're using motion. And to me, there's a lot more you can do with that because we already know how to do certain things. So when we're coming up with mechanics for our VR games, something like opening a door, that's not like a mechanic you have to teach somebody. There's a lot of one-to-one movements that you can do and a lot more immersive things in VR. So taking a typical game where, hit A to interact with this, I don't think it's smart to try to replicate what other, older kind of games are doing.
I think the same can be said for augmented reality. Just the way that it uses space requires a very specific way of designing. You see a lot of very casual mobile games that have sort of added very basic AR versions of their games, which essentially just translates the whole game like onto a flat surface. So you can play like a block dropping game on your table, which is cool as a novelty, but it doesn't really utilize the space or the design in any new way. So I think to be actually compelling as a product, you definitely need to be thinking about ways to use the space and the technology more than just to show off that you can, essentially.
Yeah, and kind of add to that, I think some other things you got to think about, especially when developing a VR game, and what we've seen when we've demoed stuff, is people try to interact with everything in there. So when you play a regular video game, it's really easy to kind of tell what you can do, what you can't, what hallways you can go down, and all that kind of stuff. it's different with VR because, people like to explore and interact with things and are expecting something similar to real life. So it's a lot more complicated to try to think of, what is a player going to do when they step foot in our world? And now they have a 360-degree field of view, and how do we direct the player's attention? There's just a lot more complicated kind of things you have to deal with when developing for a VR game.
In both AR and VR, a lot of the design kind of traditions, like stuff that works and has worked for the entirety of like video games or interactive experiences like apps, you got to throw most of it out. So even if you are like porting Skyrim, the UI isn't going to work the same way. The way the player interacts is just inherently different.
Thank you. You've kind of already touched on this with these answers, but is there anything else that you can think of, as opposed to your typical game development? What are some challenges you might face with AR and VR as compared to regular game dev?
I'd say the biggest one I noticed was in VR. When you make a game, you sort of use the minimum possible quality for all of your assets in the game. So if something's going to be far away, it's always going to be far away, and you can make it like very low resolution, very low detail. In VR, people are literally like picking up random props and holding them right up to their face. So you don't know, like, does this highlighter need a 4K texture? It might. So that was the hardest thing for me moving into VR, was just how can we manage all of these assets and how can we create them?
I would say a unique issue we've ran into is, we've demoed our VR project at a lot of different expos and things like that. And, typically when you take a game to an expo, you're looking for feedback to see what people think. Well, the issue we ran into is we're demoing it to a bunch of people that have never tried VR before. So we realized after, a couple months, we're catering our game towards people that have never touched this technology, which is not what we want to release our game for, because obviously the people that are going to be playing this have a VR headset, have played a bunch of VR games. So it was more of a challenge for us is to rethink, what are we doing when we bring it to expos? How are we developing our game for, this audience that we definitely don't have as much access to? So it's a unique issue that we hadn't really thought about before, demoing it at expos.
I'll just add that from a production standpoint, it definitely adds time for testing and iteration. Obviously, as you're making a game, just like a normal game to be played on a screen, it's very easy to get in and to test a certain part, but if you need to set up a VR area or you need to use your device to test AR functionality, there's a lot more setup that you have to do. And when you're testing, hundreds of times a day or however many times, it really adds up. So if you're going to be making a project, you need to sort of take into consideration the time it takes to literally just test it is longer.
James, I think you should touch on how you develop underwater without your VR headset.
So when you're building a game, there is so much like in and out of testing. Like every time you do something super tiny, you want to go in there and test it. And I was just over time, it takes a few seconds to put the headset on. I had the same problem with AR. It takes a few seconds to build it, or a few minutes to build it. If you're doing that like 300 times in a day, you're wasting a lot of time. So for my AR and VR experiences, I make the entire thing playable as a first-person game or a traditional mobile game, which is interesting because I end up making a game that only I'm going to be playing, which is fun, kind of weird. And then I also have to debug my own debug tools. Like I have to test the first-person controls, make sure they work right. And then when I'm done, you get in VR and there's a whole bunch of new bugs that you don't even see with the, I guess, like traditional version of the game. Same's true for apps.
Cool. Tyler, you kind of touched on this on a problem that VR has, in that not a lot. It's an emerging market, so not a lot of people have VR headsets. How do you guys reach your audiences with trying to find people who do have VR headsets, or trying to create something like that killer app that would get people to buy VR headsets? Like, what are some ways and problems you've seen sort of dealing with that?
It's tough because we can only do so much as a small indie company, making this game. So all we can do is go to as many expos as we can, talk to as many people as we can, and really push the idea that VR and AR are the next evolution in entertainment. And with that, you see year after year that there's more and more people slowly getting these headsets. So that's why, we've never been in a rush to release our game, because we think that if we just release it, there's not enough audience and it'll just disappear. Unless you're a game like Beat Saber or something like that really stands out. So all we can do is kind of talk about it, and on the back end, we work on the business side of things. So how can we do business to business type of stuff, or architecture firms, contract work, because a lot of businesses are getting involved in VR now. So that's kind of where we've been putting our attention while we wait for the more entertainment audience to grow.
Anyone else want to say something on it? No? All right. Also, continuing off of that, for the general VR and AR market, what do you think about the market, and because it's kind of a niche market right now, because it's relatively expensive to get a VR headset and whatnot. So what do you think about the market as it is, and where do you think it may be headed?
Well, this touches on kind of what we've been talking about. There's not a lot of market penetration necessarily yet from a consumer standpoint. You see AR and VR being really useful in enterprise situations and training situations, be it medical or automotive or anything like that, because those sort of trades require really intimate knowledge of specific things and spatial awareness of how they interact. So the technology itself is really useful for those sorts of applications, but just pure entertainment applications are a little harder to market, I guess, or get out there, especially because things like VR headsets are still relatively expensive and relatively niche. Yeah. Anything to add to that?
I would say, especially when it's dealing with the market and consumer stuff, at least what we talk about is avoiding being gimmicky, because a lot of, VR's been here before, AR's been here before, and it was never ready, and it came off as gimmicky. And we try to avoid that with anything we release or anybody we talk to about a possible contract job, because everybody has ideas for what to do with VR, what to do with AR. But unless you're really actively working in it or, use it a lot, you might not fully understand what your idea means. So that's like one of those things is, we're worried about it becoming gimmicky, because that could hurt the market.
Anything to add, James?
Yeah, and Michael touched on this a little bit. So we did see a huge surge in excitement and projects being made for entertainment in these different mediums. And right now, it seems like the push for entertainment is not so much. People who bought the headsets already got it. They're already excited. And now technology is being driven more by medical applications, engineering applications, and business to business. But that's going to drive technology forward and costs down. So I think we'll be seeing entertainment get like a second wind in the near future here.
Very cool. So, Mike, I know you deal more with AR than you do VR in the mobile space. Do you think that, as opposed to VR, which kind of has to, design from the ground up, do you think that AR can be used to augment games even further than games already are? Do you think it can be used for a lot more? What are some cool uses that you think that AR can be used for in mobile games, and maybe games that aren't mobile games going online?
That's a good question. I think I am really excited about mobile AR specifically because it solves that market penetration issue. Everyone has a phone. Obviously, that has limitations in how you can use it and where you can use it. Even things like plane detection and wall detection, these technologies which are getting more advanced, you're still not really, your phone isn't really capable of completely understanding the world around you. So you're still limited in some ways in where you can do things. I still think, at least for right now, if you're going to create an AR experience for a phone, you need to really think about it from the ground up. How can you take advantage of the spatialness and that aspect of it? And obviously AR is really exciting just for informational design. So from Google Maps doing AR to things like that, where you're augmenting real life in a way that actually helps you, either by overlaying information that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, or by allowing your attention to be on something while it sort of feeds you information in the background. That's super interesting. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. I'm all in on AR glasses when they come out eventually, and don't look dumb, but so I think it's really exciting. Like I said, it's a little difficult still for games just because it requires, especially mobile gamers, I think really enjoy playing mobile games. A lot of them do because of how simple it is. You can just take out your phone and play, but you can't really play an AR game like on the bus or anything like that. So it requires a little more setup. But as James was saying, once these technologies sort of mature and even once like medical or engineering applications start to advance the technology, I think people are going to start to come around and the technology will get good enough where you can start doing things on the bus. When you can play AR on the bus, we're in. We're good.
You kind of mentioned them. They started it kind of with Google Glass and it had kind of a rough go of it, and now we've got the HoloLens and just recently the Magic Leap. Do you think that AR glasses are going to like become a lot bigger?
Oh yeah,
and more of a market that you can develop things for?
I think so. I don't see how a pair of AR glasses that actually does what it's supposed to do, I don't see how that isn't a big deal for a lot of people. So it is exciting. And again, I think it's just a matter of the technology getting powerful enough and small enough to be like worn without looking dumb and without being super intrusive on everything else. So concerns about like privacy and secretly recording people aside, I think that AR glasses are going to be a pretty big deal for gaming and everything else.
Awesome. So moving away kind of from the business and like struggles of VR and AR side of things, I want to know what are some projects maybe you've worked on, virtual reality, augmented reality related, and maybe what's your favorite that you've made?
That I've made? Yeah. Oh, there's this really cool game on the App Store. It's called Pest Invasion. It's free, so you can all download it. That was a game that we made, James and I, at Super 77, sort of an attempt at, as I was saying, like integrating actual spatial awareness into a sort of simple mobile game. It was fun to make, didn't necessarily set the world on fire from a commercial standpoint, but there's just all those challenges with AR, all of that's built into that. So I haven't played a lot of phone AR games. I mentioned the mobile games that sort of add an AR version where it's just the game but on a table. That stuff isn't as interesting to me. As far as virtual reality goes, Dungeon Brewmaster is another really good game. James, you want to talk about Dungeon Brewmaster?
Yeah. So I'm working on. Well, we finished Dungeon Brewmaster. It's in early access right now, and I'm working on a game with Tyler. But both are VR games. Like I love them. A lot of passions in there. I can't really pick a favorite right now. Dungeon Brewmaster is a little more finished, so I got to give credit to that. But both Dungeon Brewmaster and Under H2O or Underwater, I'm very proud of. It's been a lot of fun to work on them, and I mean both games are gorgeous. They have beautiful art, and I think being able to work on my own games is fun. But being able to like see this crazy good art, like these beautiful characters and beautiful graphics right in front of me is like just something else. It's super special.
Do you have a favorite, Tyler?
Yeah, it's called Underwater. We've done a bunch of little projects at Guesswork, AR and VR. Just test little things, like we've made, fake little AR food menus, or we actually just made like a VR Super Soaker demo for the New York Toy Fair this past week, which was really cool. But definitely Underwater's my favorite that we've worked on. Just because me and Anthony, the two guys that founded the company, are very set on story and pushing the limits of what storytelling means. And, having a game that it looks like a plumbing simulator, we get that a lot. But it's a lot deeper than that. It's a world where plumbers are seen as superheroes. And really trying to do something different and putting the player in the shoes of somebody else. Having that goal and the passion of our team behind it, it's been my favorite project I've ever worked on, and can't wait to finish it at some point.
Yeah, I just want to add, it's super fun to make these games, so it's hard, but it's definitely worth it. I mean, especially if you're an artist, to see in VR your art around you is an entirely different thing. So don't be discouraged by it's hard, but it's worth it.
Okay, just one more, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. We've got 2 microphones here, so get your questions in your heads, and if you want to come up to these mics and ask them, please do. Tyler, you mentioned Beat Saber. Are there any games that you've seen that like do something interesting with VR, or something that is, sort of moved the medium to a really unique and interesting place that really takes advantage of the sort of dynamic things that VR allows you to do that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because I think there's still a lot of games out there that aren't worth playing, and I don't mean that in like man, they should never have made that. It's more of like they haven't really changed kind of the formula of what makes a game fun. I think Beat Saber is a great example of using VR as a medium to push what it means to make a game. Honestly, Rec Room is incredible. I've had so much fun in there. You're put into a community of random people, and you're doing these crazy things like running through dungeons and shooting robots. That is one of the first times I've played a game online in a while and actually enjoyed it, playing with random people. Outside of that, it's a very small demo, but it was called The Cubicle, and honestly, that changed the way I look at things you can do in VR, just because it blew my mind as taking, this normal office space and taking me somewhere I never would have expected before I played. And it's had a huge influence on the way I kind of design stuff in VR.
For me, the one that sticks out the most, and there's a lot of high-quality games and experiences out there, but it's a virtual reality game. It's called VVR. It stands for virtual reality, and it doesn't seem like a lot at first. It's like a kind of an adventure story game, and then you start to navigate between another VR world in the VR world, and by the end of it, like, you're taking headsets off and putting them on in the world, and just the way it behaves is like super unexpected, and like every little thing is not going to do what you thought it would. Like, there's a part where there's a slab of butter and it starts talking to you and like ordering you around, and by the time I finished, I played it all straight through, like 3 hours. I took off my headset and I'm just like looking around, and it's just a very surreal feeling to have been like going in and out of fake virtual realities and going deeper and coming up, and just that mechanic is something I don't think you could do anywhere else. So VVR, if anyone's interested.
I don't play games, so I don't have a VR headset at home, but I really like Rec Room. We had it at the office, and it was super fun. And I just think it's interesting to see those VR worlds where it's just something very normal, like the Cubicle, or like VR chat, where it's just you walking around talking to people. Something very mundane, but because it's within the context of this new technology, you're seeing normal things in a whole new way, and it's a super interesting phenomenon for sure.
Cool. Okay, so we'll open it up to audience questions.
You can go first.
All right.
No, you go first. No, I'll go first. Because I got 2 questions. I got 2 questions. You do too? Yes. You got 2? Okay, great. We'll take turns. All right. So, James, I'd just like to hear some of the bugs that show up with a headset that don't show up otherwise. And then, Will, if it's not too much, I did your demo at GDX with the square, and you think you're walking straight and you're not. So those are my 2 questions. How it works, Will.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Sure with the question.
So there was a pretty interesting one that we came across recently where, so in underwater, you walk around, but the room is bigger than your space, so you got to teleport around. So I played like this demo we have today in first person, like dozens of times, and I was like, okay, everything works, we're good. And sent it over to Tyler so he could try it in the headset, because I was only in virtual reality, or I was only in first person shooter mode, and he's just like, I can't move. So that was like one that I wouldn't see anywhere else. We also had this crazy one that wasn't so much testing the game, it was testing, it was when we went to go show the game. We took it to GDX, which is like the local game conference for anyone who hasn't heard of it. And we put the headset on, we were just flying around back and forth all over the place. And we couldn't figure it out because it wasn't happening to anyone's build, it wasn't happening on our computers. And we figured out other booths were having the same bug, and it's because those black towers that the Vive uses to locate itself, it was finding everyone's. So we had like it had no idea where you were because it was looking at the next booths over VR and trying to figure out, okay, where am I if the headset's over, the tracker's there, well now it's there, now it's there. So it was a little like disorienting, yeah.
Yeah, and the second question was how that works. So locomotion, at least I think, is the biggest problem with developing for VR, because you're putting someone into an extremely immersive space digitally, and you can give them literally infinite space to move around in digitally. But of course, the real world isn't like that. You know, people are playing these in their living rooms, and they have, you know, a certain amount of space. So, you know, teleportation is a really good way of getting around that. But, you know, I made the project he's talking about utilized a technique called redirected walking, which has you walk around literally just physically, like you walk as you normally do, and the environment is built in such a way that it allows you to do that, and it takes into account that you're doing that. So how it works is actually all parts of the environment and all the different rooms and hallways that you walk through all occupy the same space simultaneously. And the game, depending on where you are in the experience, it activates certain parts of the environment to show and deactivates other parts. So you are actually digitally walking around the same space just as you are in the real world, but the environment is specifically designed with that in mind so that you can walk through different areas and go to different places. Hey, Leonard.
Hey. I got 2 questions, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, cool. The first question is, what issues do you believe we're going to run into, challenges we're going to run into with the standalone headsets that are coming out, like the Vive Focus? Actually, the Vive Focus is already out, but the Quest and the Mirage Solo, that's actually already out too. So how are those standalone headset challenges going to be, and what are they going to be, you believe?
I don't know too much yet about how those headsets are going to work. I mean, one thing I worry about is going to standalone is they're going to be lower powered. And to me, a lot of us are developing on a PC for something that's connected to a PC. So then we have to take into account what it means to go to a lower quality version of our game to be on one of these standalone headsets. I mean, obviously, I do see a lot of these catching up at some point. But I mean, that would be my greatest concern, but I do think they're heading in the right direction. So I think it would be smart of us to plan to build for those, because those are the ones that are going to get into consumers' homes. Because right now, needing to buy a PC, buy a headset, have all these extra things you got to do, there's a reason a lot of people aren't buying them, because it's complicated. So I think what they're doing is the correct direction. Anything?
All right. My second question is actually to Michael. So you've touched on it really quickly. You mentioned about the use of augmented reality, the idea that we are using the camera to actually see into the camera is kind of our window into this world. The thing is that we're using a camera, which is something that some people don't like enjoying, because the fact is that they're being seen by you. So the issue is that we might be running into like possibly recording people or playing games in a public space while the people are around using augmented reality. What do you think, like, how do we solve that issue, and what challenges, or is there any type of way to do it so we can actually just have everybody be comfortable?
Well, I think that would take just a lot of time, a lot of getting used to the idea that this is normal now. It is definitely a concern. I think it was a concern with like the Google Glass when that came out, and any of those, you're always concerned about privacy. If you have a camera attached to you at all times, you don't want people recording you, obviously. So it is a challenge. I think it will come, as AR gets more adopted and people get more used to seeing that in the wild, they'll be a little less concerned about it. But I think it's always going to be an issue you need to take into account, for sure. I don't know if I necessarily have a solution like now. Don't make an AR game that requires you to film other people, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you.
Hello. So this is for the panel, but so James mentioned how testing is a big part of VR and AR development. And coming from the mobile and web space, our test plans for even simple applications reach hundreds of scenarios. So we have to automate them. And I was wondering, have any of you seen or used automation for VR or AR, or is everything manual, I guess?
I'll just touch on AR really quick. So when we were developing Pest, there really isn't a good way to automate that stuff, which is why it takes so long. You need to test not only the game, but because it's augmenting reality, you have to test in like different actual lighting conditions. So for someone who's very used to working in as dark a cave as possible, you have to actually get out the lights. You have to test not only in different lighting conditions, but different devices. Different devices have different cameras. So a camera that's lower quality is going to have more trouble tracking things. So as far as I can tell, manually, well, at least I haven't figured out a way to automate it effectively yet. I'm sure it might be possible, but for us, it was just a matter of having a drawer of 10 devices that you can just build on, turn the lights off and on. It's a whole thing.
Right.
Yeah, so I did actually do some automation for my testing of Dungeon Brewmaster. It is primarily like a crafting game, so you have to like take two items, combine them together, chop this up, it's cooking. And after kind of doing it like, I want to say 1,000 times, I was like, this is taking too long. There's got to be a faster way. And I didn't really, it wasn't really like code based. It was an animation. I just made an animation and kind of saved the movement of all the crafting items. So it was sort of like cooking itself, and that significantly sped up testing time. But then just like the first person version of Underwater, there ended up being bugs like, oh, well, this works if it's floating by itself and putting itself in the pot, but when you put it in the pot with your hand, there's a weird bug. So you can test a lot of like the process to see if things are triggering correctly and the story's happening, but then when you get down to the mechanics, you do have to test it yourself as well.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't tried to automate anything outside of what kind of James has mentioned there, and I think the biggest difficulty there is it's kind of when somebody can move around an entire space like that, it's a little bit more difficult to predict what somebody's going to do, and we've learned that every time trying to create a tutorial is that we can't even predict what somebody's going to look at first. I think it'd be great to find out automation techniques, and I think kind of like the animation stuff you're talking about is a good direction. Maybe recording, how players are playing our game and taking that data and figuring out an automated method through it. But yeah, it might be a little more difficult than automating something on a 2D screen. So, but I think that's a good question. I never thought about that.
Yeah, that animation thing would sound really cool. Like I wouldn't think of that. But yeah, thank you.
So I guess this is for everyone, but I know that, Michael, you mentioned using virtual reality and augmented reality for applications in like the medical field and other like engineering and things like that. And it's really interesting to me because a lot of technologies first are used in medical or engineering or military applications, and then later are adapted to be used in the entertainment field, but it seems that virtual reality is the other way around, and I don't know that we've seen this before. We're using it for the entertainment field, and now the medical and engineering fields are adapting it. So how do you feel that that's going to alter the evolution of this technology?
It's a good question. I think the reason that technology is able to sort of be incubated in those medical engineering spaces is just because they have the budgets to afford it before consumers can. So yeah, VR has sort of entered at this weird ground level where everyone sort of has access to it. I think that'll just make it faster to be adopted by everyone else, which I think is a good thing for all of us. But I still think, the real attention right now is mostly in those medical and engineering spaces. So we're still going to get some of that. They're going to go off and do their thing with their millions of dollars. And then once that technology gets better and cheaper, and, we'll start to see the results of that on the consumer side. But it is cool that as consumers we have access to the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is because the Oculus kind of surprised a lot of people when it first came out. Because VR has been tried so many times, then all of a sudden out of nowhere this consumer level VR device comes out, and it's accessible to a lot of people. And with the way game development's been moving with things like Unity and Unreal, it's made it so much easier for an indie level dev to get into something emerging tech like this. So I think it has been kind of a couple attributes. It's kind of led to this. And when we went and talked to people in the medical field, engineering field about, what we can do with VR to help them, there are a lot that have been using it, but a lot of people still don't necessarily understand it, and still are looking for us to explain what can we do, what can't we do. And as you kind of said, I don't think that's really been the case before. So it is a very interesting viewpoint.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Hello. This is a question for the panel in general. Since VR, very much like you were talking about with the experience of QA, where you're going through and people are having, very different experiences, you don't know what they're going to look at first. What are some of the challenges related to that when it comes to actually getting out there and marketing or selling your game? Because at least in my experience, when I've seen a game in 2D, especially a VR game, and then the experience that I have in VR once I actually play it is really vastly different because of the immersive nature of it. Now, sure, the 2D part, got me interested in it, got me excited about it. But what are some of the strategies or tactics that you all have seen that have been successful in getting out there, getting attention, getting people to recognize, what the immersive experience might do for them, and for your games or VR in general, any of the above?
How's it going, Tom?
Hey, man, how are you?
Good. I think one of the coolest ways I've seen VR games advertised is when they, surround the play space and the green screen, and you can actually see the player run around that world. I think that is definitely a more appealing version of how to advertise this. I think, eventually as more of these headsets get passed along, you're going to see maybe 360 renders of a trailer instead of, a 2D traditional trailer, so that people can pop in the headset and actually stand in there and witness it. But a lot of those things, haven't been done yet or really figured out. So it is more challenging, and it's more of, using the idea that VR is still cool and hip and the next thing as a way to market it still.
Yeah, it's tough for sure. Facebook has those 360 pictures. I think we did one of those for Dungeon Brewmaster where, you can take like a 3D panorama of the game world, and then in the Facebook browser as a user, you can sort of like look around, but it's still on a 2D screen. So it's not the same at all. AR at least has started, because there are so many devices that can do it. You can now, you'll get ads when you're playing a mobile game. That's like an AR ad, so you can like do it in AR. Right. So that's a lot easier just because of how many people have AR devices. VR is definitely a trickier one.
Yeah, and I'd say an unexpected kind of way to present things to the player came for us when we went to market Dungeon Brewmaster. Our key marketing strategy was to get it into the hands of YouTube personalities. It went pretty well, and a big thing that we saw was it sort of sold you on what it would be like to be the person playing the game, not the game itself. So their YouTubers are just like over emphatic. It's almost like reality TV, where they're like overreacting to everything and like, whoa, that's huge, and like, oh, this guy looks really big. And that really helped our potential players see, oh wow, look how much fun he's having. This would be really fun to be there, and not just, oh, this is what it looks like on my TV.
That makes sense. Did you have trouble identifying influencers who were specifically VR AR influencers as opposed to influencers who had VR AR?
It was a little bit tougher to find the VR AR influencers, but we kind of just hit anyone we saw. Like if they had one video where they had VR headsets, we just sent them an email.
Gotcha.
Just casting a really wide net and seeing who picks it up.
Cool. Thank you.
So you talked a little bit earlier about, and I think Tyler, you're the one that mentioned it, which is when you have a lot of objects in space, a player wants to interact with every single one of those objects. So I'm curious about, in your experiences, how you've come to be able to manage unreasonable negative possibility space, where the combinatory of explosion of, if I want any objects in my world, it means I now have 50 more interactable objects that we have to program. But I kind of want to tie this into interactivity another way, which means I want to slide another question here, which is, how do you make your meaningful interactions really meaningful? How do you make opening this heavy door meaningful when no matter what, you always have 2 pounds in your hands? I'm kind of curious of like how you guys have tackled interactions with that, between limiting, saying, hey, this is just a cup, don't overthink it, and this is a grand gesture, when you always have the same tool.
It's a really good question, because we have a lot of ideas. We haven't tried them all yet. For example, limiting, interaction. There's ideas of just, changing the color of different objects to show players what's interactable and what's not. But making it meaningful is a good question. One way we think we can do that is by adding, like for example, going to an escape room. We use this all the time. Is you're in a random room with a bunch of objects, kind of like what it feels like to be in a VR room. And what you're looking for is to figure out how do you escape this room? What's cool is you're doing a lot of weird things, but once you do something cool, or you find what you're looking for, you open this chest. The meaning is behind the mystery of what's going to be the next thing, what's behind the chest, or what's behind the door. And that's where we're seeing story or puzzles and story being combined as being a really cool way to add weight to it, to what you're doing, to kind of ignore that you have a 2-pound control in your hand and you're opening what should be like a 20-pound door or something like that, is to kind of just make them forget that's what's happening and be more worried about what's on the other side. It's kind of what we're thinking. Who knows if it'll work yet though.
We sort of masked that issue in Dungeon Brewmaster. Like, I don't think I've seen any effective way to give like a physical weight to an object or kind of highlight one interaction over another. But at Super 77, our designs are very character focused, and what we ended up doing for our Magic cooking game is half the ingredients are like characters who have their own faces and their own animations, and then a lot of them are super useful. So I think, we hope players are more concerned with what could this be if I combine it with this, and not so concerned with what is this now. Good question.
Thank you.
So my question more so is it ever that like AR is more conventional because it's enhancing the world around you, while VR might become too much, similar to what he said, like you try to recreate everything and it's going to try to replace the world around you, when it's easier to interact with people playing video games together if you still can see the world around you, like in AR, Pokemon Go and stuff like that. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel like I've been, asked that question a lot. Is which one's going to be more important? Is VR going to suck up all of our time and everybody's going to enter the virtual world? Well, if that's true, then we're probably already in the virtual world. But no, what I do think is that AR is kind of like going to replace our cell phones. Basically, AR is the practical everyday use, where VR is what we turn, such as a TV, to entertainment. I don't see VR becoming like we're sucked in there forever. I just don't see it replacing that anytime soon.
Okay, so I know for to use AR on some phones, you need a gyroscope. Is that true for all devices, or just phones?
It does depend on the type of AR technology.
Okay.
Some AR experiences are built on like an image, like a poster or something, and those ones don't necessarily need a gyroscope for the experience. But a lot of them use pretty much everything in your phone to kind of make that AR experience happen. So they need like the compass, the gyroscope, and on Apple stuff, even the GPS needs to be activated.
Yeah, it's almost like they're taking all the sensors in the phone, all the data from that to do what it does. So I think most modern AR technologies are going to need at least a gyroscope to function properly. But as James was saying, some things like image recognition might not necessarily need it.
Okay, thank you.
So, Tyler, I think you mentioned Rec Room, and Mike, you mentioned VR chat, and both of those have very heavy social elements. Do you think that that's a big part of like where the future of VR lies, is creating sort of social spaces for people to interact, almost like they do in the real world, but digitally and across continents and things?
I mean, I think there's definitely a huge potential for just hanging out in a virtual room with your relatives from across the country. Like, if that's a possibility, then people are going to want to do that for sure. So something like that is a really useful, practical application of it. VR chat, as it exists today, is not particularly like serious or useful. It's just the novelty of and the anonymity of it is what makes it sort of fun. Yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah, again, turning back to story, it's funny. I actually got convinced to work on VR here when I was meeting with John Bowditch, and he told me, along the lines, imagine, in Lord of the Rings, sitting at the table and deciding to join Frodo on his quest. And that, to me, is what kind of sold me. But I think, what the next step from there is, like right now, TV is huge, and we enjoy watching things like Game of Thrones and stuff as, together as a group. How cool would it be, with social spaces? D&D is another example of something popular to do with friends. Imagine combining those together in VR, where you're experiencing stories together, and you can, really take that experience to the next level. I think that's, a little bit more than a social space, but I think the possibilities there is really cool of what that can do for you.
Yeah, I do think there is a bright future for social experiences in VR. I think that's why Facebook kind of got involved with VR, was just so, like, hey, you have friends, well, now we can sell you hardware to interact with your friends who you've been keeping up with. Instead of just seeing photos, I can sit next to Tyler in a VR room and like hand him the photos, and there's a lot to the social experience that you just lose when you go straight to traditional medium, but you get back with VR.
Cool. I think we got time for one or two more questions.
It's a really quick question. So why haven't y'all decided to work on console for the PSVR? Have you just thought about it, considered it, or wanted to jump into it? I'm just curious. Yeah, making something for PlayStation VR. Is there some, like, are you so you're focused? So mostly you're focused on like PC and mobile, but have you considered going to PSVR?
I mean, we've talked about it a lot. For underwater, one issue is cost. It is pretty expensive for a dev kit for an indie developer to kind of jump to that. One day we would love to pitch underwater to Sony, and hopefully go that route instead. Kind of like what Beat Saber did. But the other thing we gotta think about is we've been developing for a room scale device where you can walk around a room. Obviously you can teleport. But there are some unique challenges you then have to deal with again for PlayStation VR. But it was always within our plans to eventually get to it. Just it wasn't the first.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, I think we wanted DBM on PSVR. That was part of the plan originally, but just from a practical production standpoint, like licenses and things like that is a way more complex beast on a console than it is on like a PC with Steam. So we just didn't have the production time to invest in doing that port and going through that whole process.
I understand. Sorry, my question sounded like, why aren't you doing it? But it was kind of like, I'm just curious about it is all. All right, thank you.
All right, I think this is going to have to be the last question.
I was just thinking that ever since the Ready Player One movie came out, has there been increased demand for virtual reality? Because obviously what's shown there is far away from ever happening. But has you seen an uptick in demand for it because of, say, the movie that came out?
I don't know about something that you can measure. I would say that I got a lot of text about it when the movie came out of like, hey man, you live in Columbus and work on VR, is this real? I do think it came out at a great time because it did get more people to, well, I'd love to try VR now that, I've seen this movie and see the possibilities of it. So I think it's cool because it opened up a lot of people's imagination and allowed them to think that, hey, maybe VR is a great direction to go.
Yeah, I don't have any data on whether or not demand increased, but it definitely increased familiarity with VR and how it's supposed to work. I think most people, if you ask them if they've heard of VR, people know about it. People have seen it working. It looks like real life. If you go to someone and you're like, hey, check out this AR thing, most people are like, what the heck is that? So definitely helped people become familiar with technology, which is definitely an important step to mass adoption.
Anything else you guys want to add or say? All right, well, I think that wraps it up for our panels today. Thank you, everyone, for coming out and listening, and thank you guys for coming.